Hi guys, and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about how to win your pawn endgames when you are dealing with the rook pawns. So the pawns on the A or H file. Now, this is going to be a part 2 to my last video where we discussed how to win your pawn endgames when you are dealing with pawns between the B and G files. And rook pawns are different, so I wanted to reserve those for their own video, which we are going to be discussing today. But if you haven't seen the first video, I'm going to link it here. I suggest you watch it before watching this one because we are going to be building upon the concepts discussed in that video today. And this video will make a lot more sense to you if you have seen that video. You should know what to do in your pawn endgames regardless of which file the pawns are on, so you should see both of the videos in order to make sure you don't lose your pawn endgames. But with that, let's jump into it and talk about how to win with the rook pawns. Okay. In my last video, we discussed this concept of key squares, which you can use to determine where you need to place your king in order to either facilitate or prevent the promotion of a pawn. So this pawn here on b4 is between the B and G files. It has not yet crossed the 5th rank. Therefore, the key squares for this pawn on b4 are a6, b6, and c6. This black pawn on d3 has crossed the 5th rank. Therefore, the key squares are c2, d2, and e2. And if you are lost and this is not making sense to you, please see my last video where we discuss this concept of key squares in more detail. But we know the key squares of these two pawns. What about this pawn on the H file? So in order to find the key squares for the rook pawns, you first must identify the promotion square, which in this case is H8, and the key squares are going to be the two squares adjacent to the promotion square. So in this case, G7 and G8. Similarly, if the pawn was on the A file, the key squares would be B7, B8, and if it was black coming this way, the key squares would be G1, G2, or on the A file, B1 and B2. Those are the key squares that you, as the attacker, should aim to put your king in order to facilitate the promotion of the pawn. The rule is if the attacker can get their king to one of these key squares and the pawn cannot be captured, the pawn is going to promote, therefore the attacker is winning. So these are the key squares that white should aim to get their king to. Now, for black in this case, the defender, their goal is to occupy any of the 6 squares surrounding this promotion square. And the reason for that is if black can get their king into any of these 6 squares, the white king is not going to be able to occupy the key squares, and therefore the pawn is not going to be able to promote, therefore it is a draw. So white's goal here is to get their king to one of these 2 squares, G7 or G8, and black, in order to prevent the promotion, should aim to get their king to either F7, F8, G7, G8, or H7 or H8. And that is essentially the concept of key squares and how it applies to the rook pawns. Now let's take it into some puzzles and make some more sense of this. So we have our first position here. It is white to move, and my question to you is, who is winning here? Or is it a draw? And why? So it's white to move. They can play b1 using this concept of opposition to shield out the enemy king and to occupy the defensive squares, preventing this. Like, let's say if white was to go, I don't know, d1, well, now all of a sudden black is winning because they can get to the key squares and push the pawn. So the only option here for white is to play b1, occupying these defensive squares, preventing the king from entering, and therefore after a2, we have king a1, and the position is a draw. So now let's look at what happens if it's black's move. Does this change anything? And it does, because black can play a2, and now all of a sudden, white cannot enter this b1 square. Therefore, white's only move is to abandon the pawn, and on the next move, this pawn is promoting, and black is winning. We have another position here. It is black to move and draw. My question to you is, how does black get the draw here? Now, black has a couple options. They can either go king f6 or they can go king g5 and try and capture this pawn. Let's first look at what happens if black just goes towards the pawn. You can see the engine doesn't like this move because now white has h6, and after that, the black king is forced to not only abandon this pawn, but it's not going to be able to reach the squares in time. So after king f6, we have king g8, and this white king is in the key squares, and there is nothing that black can do to prevent the promotion of the pawn. So white is winning here. So the correct move here for black is king f6. And this is basically telling white, okay, you can move towards these key squares, but then we're going to capture this pawn. Or if you try and save the pawn, then we can get to these defensive squares, and it's a draw in both cases. So, I mean, just for example, if white tries to go towards g8, we can capture the pawn, and, you know, the position is a draw. Meanwhile, if white tries to save the pawn, now we can occupy these squares, and again, position is a draw. Okay, we have a new position here. It is white to move and win. See if you can figure out what the best move here is for white. Now, obviously, white wants to get this pawn to a8, but this a7 pawn is preventing that. So white is going to need to do something about that. Let's first look at what happens if white is careless here and just tries to capture this pawn. As soon as the king goes to c7, the position is a draw, because black can now take this route to these defensive squares, and black king is in the defensive squares. White king can't reach these key squares. The pawn is not promoting. The position is a draw. So in order to convert this into a win for white, the best move is to play king c6. And the idea of this is we are still approaching this pawn on a7. We are going to be able to capture it shortly, but we are still shielding off this enemy king from taking the route to these defensive squares. So now, regardless of what black does, we are going to be able to capture this pawn and enter these key squares, and the pawn is going to promote. Okay. Another position here, it is also white to move and win. See if you can figure out how to do that. So if you saw my last video, you're probably looking at this g2 pawn and saying, oh, okay, it's not yet a rook pawn. We can just put the white king in the key squares and we are winning. But unfortunately, black has this h3 move and we are forced to take, otherwise they're getting a queen. But now the structure of the position has changed. White is no longer in the key squares. The key squares are now over here, and all black has to do is occupy one of these 6 squares, and it's a draw. And as it turns out, black can get there pretty easily by just scooting their way over there, and they're going to beat white to the punch because here they are. They're already on the defensive squares. Now, white cannot enter these key squares, and if they start pushing this pawn, all black has to do is shuffle back and forth, and position is a draw. So we know that king f4 is not the answer. So what should white do instead to convert this position to a win? King f5. And this is a dual purpose move because it's not only threatening g4 taking the pawn, but now white is able to reach these key squares before black can defend against it. So if now black tries to play h3, white can take, and there is nothing black can do to prevent white from reaching these key squares. Now, you know, black can't enter these defensive squares. All white needs to do is push the pawn, and you know how this story ends. Okay, a new position here, black to move and draw. See if you can find the best move for black here. Now, basically, we have 2 options. We can either move the pawn, or we can try and get the black king to these defensive squares. However, we see that the white king is already in the key squares, and it's just going to take them 1-2 moves to capture our pawn and to return to these key squares. And at that point, black is going to be here on d7, not yet in these defensive squares. And at that point, there is going to be nothing that black can do to stop the promotion of the pawn. So just in case you're having a hard time visualizing, let's say black says, okay, I'm going to try and move towards these defensive squares. Now white is winning because they are in the key squares. This pawn is going to promote. There's nothing black can do to stop it. White is winning. So instead, our best option is to play a5. And the reason for this is because white has to abandon these key squares in order to capture the pawn. And that is going to afford us enough time to reach these defensive squares, and it is a draw. All right, we have a new position here. This is a theoretical draw. The goal is to try and make a draw as white. But it is black's move, and black has 2 options. And in both cases, we need to figure out how white can obtain the draw. So let's first look at what happens if black plays king c3. How does white get the draw here? Obviously, black is threatening to capture our pawn and then occupy the key squares of this b7 pawn, thus winning. So we need to figure out how we're going to prevent that. And the best move for white is to play king e3. And after b4, we can play this very timely a6 move. And what we're doing is we're forcing black to recapture our pawn. And now our king can get to these defensive squares because the structure has changed. The pawn is now on this a file. All we need to do is get our white king to occupy these squares, and the position is going to be a draw. Now let's see what we should do if black plays d3. Can you figure out the best move for white here to earn the draw? We can see that the black king is 1, 2, 3 moves away from capturing our a5 pawn. And it's our move, and we can see we are 1, 2, 3, 4 moves away from capturing this pawn on b7. So white can say, okay, you can take our pawn, but we are going to take yours. And that is the strategy here, because as black continues to march towards our pawn, we are going to be able to capture theirs. They take ours, we take theirs. Again, the position is a draw. So that is how you would earn a draw here, regardless of what black's intentions are. All right, so that is how you can win your pawn endgames when the rook pawns are involved. I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up so I know to make more like it, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you can see future uploads from me and we can continue to work on getting better at the game of chess together. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any requests for future videos, concepts, topics of chess-related things that you would like to learn and therefore I should learn and make a video about. I want to hear from you on what you guys want to see. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.